Today we're going to focus on state and state-sponsored terrorism, two different subjects that we're going to dig into today. So I think this is an important topic to focus on because the majority of the class, what we talk about, what we focus on is terrorism perpetuated by what we would consider non-state actors. So before we jump in, really dig into this, I think it's really important to clarify what we mean by state terrorism versus terrorism committed by non-state actors. And so I think the way we can really start to clarify this and really make it understandable is by looking at how we define what a state is. So in the most basic sense, we oftentimes in political science use the terms state and country as interchangeable. We don't think about states just as what we think of in when we take a U.S. government class in terms of these subunits of government. In political science and government classes, when we use the word state, we're thinking about a political unit with sovereignty over a particular territory and group of people. And so this is really thinking about, in some sense, the ultimate authority, the ultimate governing force in a particular country. And so we also think about states and think a key feature of states is that they possess what we call a monopoly of violence. That states are the only entity within a particular area that they control that have the capacity to determine when violence is going to be used, when violence is legitimate. And we think about this in terms of the fact that states prevent individuals, right, from committing acts of violence, robbery, murder, other kinds of crimes. States are the only ones that get to determine when individuals have the right to engage in perhaps violent acts, if they're even allowed to at all. States have this capacity. And then it also brings up the issue of whether states, with their monopoly of violence, have the right to do whatever it is that they see fit to do. And so this really brings us to the first question that I want you to answer. And discussion question one is, do you think states can carry out terrorist acts? Again, discussion question one, do you think states can carry out terrorist acts? And I ask this question because if states possess the monopoly of violence, if they have the legitimate right to use that violence when they see fit, can they actually engage in terrorist attacks? So think about that for discussion question one. And so you may disagree, but largely I'm going to go ahead and, as you can see by the name of the lecture, we say, and we're going to talk about state terrorism. The idea is that states, we're going to argue that perhaps they can and they do engage in terrorism. And so if we think about trying to compare rough estimates of numbers of deaths resulting from terrorism, we look at the numbers of people approximately who have died from acts of state terrorism, which we're looking here from 1915 to 2007. Approximately 120 million people have been killed from what we would argue might be considered acts of state terrorism versus non-state terrorism. Again, notice the timeline is shorter, but even if we were to extend it, it wouldn't get anywhere close to 120 million. The approximate number of people who have been killed from non-state terrorist acts between 1970 and 2017 is about 1.2 million. So we see a pretty significant discrepancy in terms of the number of deaths perpetuated by acts of state terrorism versus those perpetuated by non-state terrorists. But this brings me to the second discussion question that you're going to have. So discussion question two is, why does the media pay more attention then to terrorism perpetuated by non-state actors? Again, discussion question two, why does the media pay more attention to terrorism perpetuated by non-state actors? So, where do we see some of the major instances of state terrorism? This might help to start thinking about it and help you start to frame your thinking about what state terrorism is. Well, one, we can think of the Soviet Union, and especially the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin's control. And so it's argued that between 1928 and 1953, 20 to 50 million people were killed by the Soviet state, who were perceived to be political opponents, to send messages to potential political opponents, to really maintain the control of the Soviet government. They engaged in extensive tactics to eliminate people, to instill fear in their population, to maintain control and maintain their particular form of government. And not only were 20 50 million people killed, but millions more were in prison, sent to Siberia to work in concentration camps, work in death camps, essentially. And so we can really see the extent to which, the state can mobilize its resources to try to intimidate its population into coalescing and going along with a particular government's objectives. And they use terror to try to achieve that. And that's a key component we see in a lot of these totalitarian, authoritarian dictatorships. And we can see this as well in China. We see this with the use of terrorist tactics to try to engage in what we call the Great Leap Forward. And under Mao's leadership, and after the Communist Revolution in China that really ends in 1949, we see again, mass imprisonment, mass killings to try to ensure that the new communist government continued to exist, continued to maintain control of the Chinese territory. It's estimated that perhaps about 35 million people were killed in China during this period. And we see other examples of state terrorism have existed in the past as well that have been responsible for that authoritarian governments have tried to use to maintain control. It's argued largely, and we'll talk about this more when we look at the United States, that especially in the American South after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, that the Democratic Party, not the Democratic Party that we think of today, but the Democratic Party of the time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, had control of most of the governments of states in the American South, where very few individuals had the right to vote. African Americans were disenfranchised. Many poor whites were even disenfranchised. These various state governments in the American South, places like South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, used tactics to try and suppress African Americans. Getting back to this idea again of this ethno-racial terrorism. Well, governments of these southern states were responsible in a lot of instances for trying to perpetuate these elements of state terrorism to maintain political control. So we see this happening not only abroad, but happening at home in the United States as well. So state terrorism, though, is different than what we would consider to be what we call state-sponsored terrorism. And so state-sponsored terrorism, we look at the idea of when governments of particular countries provide resources to and support non-state terrorist actors. And they're willing to oftentimes do this to support groups internationally. And we'll look at the case study of Iran to really look at a prime example of a country using and funding terrorist organizations internationally to try and achieve their particular political objectives abroad. So we would want to ask the question, why do we think a state would actually provide resources and fund terrorist organizations? Well, oftentimes they're going to focus on providing resources to groups that either align with their objectives or in some ways help them achieve their political objectives, even if they're not completely aligned. And so they'll do this oftentimes for a number of reasons. One, it's oftentimes low cost. Providing resources to terrorist organizations internationally, oftentimes for a country like Iran, is much cheaper than trying to develop a nuclear program or trying to build up their conventional armed forces. They perhaps can get big effect for low cost by providing these groups of extremists who are willing to engage in attacks that they as a government cannot because it might be perceived as an act of war. There's much lower cost, especially financially, for them to do these particular things. As well as they have the capacity to engage in deniability. these terrorist organizations or these governments like Iran's government have the capacity to claim that they did not provide resources. They often do so in ways that are harder to detect and really establish a firm connection that the Iranian government has provided resources to a terrorist organization, say in Palestine. So they have the capacity to deny their involvement, even though they are engaging in these particular acts. These groups will often try to do it to destabilize their neighbors that they might have a rivalry with and they may be competing with. So we can see this allows them to weaken governments or potentially governments they perceive as enemy governments abroad, to potentially usher in forces that may be more supportive of their particular objectives. It also allows these governments to project power. They don't have to necessarily do so in a traditional sense of building up their military or establishing nuclear forces. If they're able to fund and arm groups abroad extensively, this is a projection of their particular power. They may use these groups, as I said, to try to change the regime, change the government in another country, to try to destabilize that country so the government collapses and is replaced by a government that is more friendly to the government that's funding and supporting these various terrorist organizations. And it also allows them to export their particular ideology. So in the case of, say, Iran, they have the objective of trying to spread the Iranian Revolution, spread their Shia version of Islam by supporting Shia groups abroad. It may end up strengthening their particular ideology and spreading it globally. So we can see there's a lot of reasons that states are going to be willing to sponsor terrorist organizations, even if right off the bat it seems counterintuitive for why they might be willing to do so. There are a lot of potential benefits for them, for states supporting terrorist organizations. So we'll leave it there for now, and we'll pick it up and really dive more in depth into the Iranian case for the case study. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the Iranian case study.